Part 1. The School on the Abandoned Graveyard. The town of Black Hollow, nestled deep within the dense forests of Maine, is perpetually shrouded in a thick mist. The town's elders whisper among themselves about the mysteries buried beneath the earth, but no one dares to speak of them outright. Perched atop a lonely hill, far from the town, stands St. Augustine Academy, a prestigious boarding school for gifted students. The academy boasts an old-world charm, its towering gray stone buildings rising solemnly among fiery red maple trees. Yet, few students are aware of a chilling secret. The school was built upon an abandoned graveyard. Over a century ago, this land served as a burial ground for society's outcasts, criminals, witches, and the insane. After a mysterious fire ravaged the cemetery, it was abandoned and soon forgotten. When St. Augustine Academy was constructed in the 1920s, the administration deliberately concealed the land's dark history. Crumbling tombstones were buried beneath layers of concrete. Remains were hastily relocated, and restless souls were left without peace. From the very first day of school, many students have felt an eerie presence. At night, footsteps echo down empty hallways. Faint whispers seep through the walls. Some students even swear they've seen shadowy figures standing at their door, only to vanish the moment the lights are turned on. Part 2. The Midnight Knocks. The first day of the new school year at St. Augustine Academy always carried an air of unease. Cold winds slipped through the towering glass windows, making the old classroom curtains shudder. The sky remained a dull gray, and thick fog clung to the campus like a veil, hiding the dark secrets buried beneath. That night, the new students quickly noticed something strange. Every night, precisely at 3 a.m., a knocking sound echoed through the dormitory. At first, everyone assumed it was just a prank by the older students. But soon, unsettling things began to happen. The knocking wasn't coming from outside the rooms, it was coming from inside. On the first night, Emily Carter, an 11th grade student, was jolted awake by a faint noise. In the pitch-black room, she could hear it, slow, deliberate knocks against wood. Emily's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from the dorm room door. It was coming from inside her closet. She swallowed hard and reached for her bedside lamp. A dim yellow glow spilled over the cold stone walls. Turning her head, she looked toward the closet in the corner of the room. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness inside swallowing the light. Emily's throat tightened as she forced herself to stand. "Probably just a rat," she muttered. She stepped forward, hesitantly grasping the closet handle. But just as she was about to pull it open, the door burst open. A freezing gust of wind rushed out from within, but there was nothing inside. No rats, no disturbed belongings, just empty, unbroken silence. Emily let out a shaky breath, ready to close the door. But then, she felt it. A cold breath against the back of her neck. She froze. Her pulse stopped. In the mirror on her vanity, she saw it. a dark figure standing right behind her. Emily screamed and bolted from the room. She ran down the hallway, banging on the door of her classmate's room. But before she could say anything, heavy footsteps echoed behind her. Not human footsteps, something heavier. Something dragging across the wooden floor. She didn't dare turn around. She pounded on the door harder. "Open up, please." After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open. Lily Patterson, her dorm neighbor, stood there, half asleep. Emily shoved past her, slamming the door shut. But before she could explain what had happened, Lily spoke first. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Emily froze. Lily glanced toward the window, which was cracked open. The wind howled through the gap. But outside, there was only darkness. Every night, Lily whispered, "I hear footsteps in the hallway." It wasn't just Emily and Lily. Within days, the entire dormitory knew about the invisible footsteps. At exactly 3 a.m., the sound would begin. First, a single thud, then another, and another. The steady rhythm of someone, or something, walking past each dorm room door. Over time, it became a terrifying ritual. At 3 a.m., every student lay still in bed, holding their breath, waiting for the footsteps to pass. But the worst part was, every night, the footsteps stopped in front of a different door. And if someone opened it at that exact moment, they were never seen again. At first, no one believed it, but then, in the second week of the school year, a student named Ethan Gray disappeared. Ethan was a troublemaker, known for his reckless pranks. One night, he decided to challenge the so-called curse of St. Augustine Academy. "There's no such thing as ghosts. You're all just scaring yourselves," he laughed, mocking his friends. So at 3 a.m., when the footsteps stopped outside his door, Ethan opened it. The entire dorm heard his scream. A loud crash echoed through the hall. And then, silence. The next morning, Ethan was gone. His bed was untouched. His clothes, his books, everything was still there. But Ethan was nowhere to be found. By the following evening, his room was locked. No one was allowed inside ever again. But the older students whispered among themselves. Every night, as they passed by Ethan's old room, they could still hear a faint knocking coming from within. Part 3. The Headmaster's Mysterious Ledger. St. Augustine Academy had never been an ordinary school. Not only the students but also the teachers and administrators could sense the strange occurrences that plagued the institution. For years, no headmaster had lasted more than 3 years. Some abruptly resigned without explanation. Others vanished without a trace. And a few were found dead in their own offices. The current headmaster, Richard Holloway, was a strict, no-nonsense man who scoffed at superstition. But ever since he took over earlier this year, eerie incidents had followed him, particularly involving the old wooden desk in his office. Knocks in the night. That night, a storm raged outside. Rain pelted against the windows, and the wind howled, whispering through the cracks like voices from beyond the grave. Headmaster Holloway sat alone in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across his tense face. He was flipping through the Academy's old archives, a thick, time-worn ledger passed down from headmaster to headmaster. But as he turned to the entry from 1924, his hand froze. Scrawled across the yellowed page in erratic handwriting were the words, "We have made a grave mistake. We should never have built here. The things buried beneath this ground, they will not let us rest." And then Holloway's head snapped up, knocking, but not from the office door. The sound was coming from inside his desk. His heart pounded in his chest. He glanced down at the heavy wooden surface, its weathered grain marred by old scratches. The knocking came again, slow, deliberate, as if someone were trapped inside. Taking a deep breath, Holloway pulled open the largest drawer. Empty, nothing inside. But just as he was about to push it shut, "Help me," a whisper drifted up from within the drawer. Holloway recoiled, his chair scraping against the floor. A chilling cold spread through the room, seeping into his bones. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Don't open the door. Don't open the door." His throat went dry. He spun around, scanning the dim office. But he was alone. The only sound was the soft flicker of his desk lamp. Then, before his eyes, the ledger's pages began to turn, on their own. They stopped at the final entry. Written in dark red ink were the words, "We cannot bury the truth forever. Once the door is open, there is no turning back." The shadow in the hallway. Holloway slammed the ledger shut, an icy dread creeping up his spine. He had to get out of there. He grabbed his keys, yanked open his office door, and stepped into the hallway. As he turned to lock the door behind him, the lights flickered, and then, they went out. The corridor was plunged into darkness, silent except for the wind whispering through the old building. He froze. At the far end of the hallway, something stood there, a shadow. It was still, yet its form twisted unnaturally, as if it did not belong to this world. Holloway tried to steady his breathing, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. Then, the shadow moved, not with footsteps. It glided forward, soundless, as if floating just above the ground. Closer, and closer. He wanted to scream, but his voice was locked inside his throat. A crushing pressure wrapped around his chest, as if unseen hands were squeezing the air from his lungs. The shadow loomed nearer. Then, it vanished. Cold breath brushed against his ear. "You shouldn't be here." Holloway bolted. He didn't know how far or how long he ran. But when he stopped, gasping for breath, he found himself standing before the forbidden basement door. A single bloody handprint was smeared across the handle. Part 4. The Forbidden Basement. Principal Holloway stood frozen before the basement door. How did he get here? He distinctly remembered running away from the terrifying shadow in the hallway. Yet somehow, he now found himself standing before the very door that every headmaster before him had warned to stay away from. On the old brass doorknob, a bloody handprint was smeared across the surface, as if someone had gripped it tightly before vanishing. "You shouldn't be here." The whisper came from right behind him, sending a chill down his spine. He spun around, but the hallway was shrouded in darkness, completely empty. A cold draft seeped from beneath the basement door. But it wasn't an ordinary kind of cold. It carried the weight of something that did not belong to this world. Yet he couldn't walk away. Something below was calling him. Holloway's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. The moment his fingers wrapped around it, the door swung open on its own. No creaking, no resistance, just a slow, eerie hiss, like a sigh escaping from the depths below. A stone staircase stretched downward into the abyss. The air was thick and heavy, swallowing every breath he took. But the strangest part? His footsteps made no sound. He glanced down. The stone floor beneath him seemed to absorb all noise, as if this place didn't want anyone to know he was here. A tomb for the dead. Holloway reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling was low, the air damp, the stone walls were covered in dried, reddish-brown handprints, desperate imprints of those who had tried to claw their way out, but never escaped. But the most unsettling sight was the scattered wooden coffins. Some of them had been forced open, and inside, no bodies, only decayed burial shrouds, torn to shreds, with deep scratch marks inside, as if the ones buried here had tried to claw their way out before they died. Holloway's breath hitched. He stepped closer to one of the open coffins. And inside, lying atop the tattered shroud, a journal. The journal of a former headmaster. Holloway picked it up. The leather cover was rotting, soaked with age and decay. But when he opened it, the writing inside was perfectly intact. October 4, 1926. I am Thomas Grayson, the third headmaster of St. Augustine Academy. They lied to me. This school wasn't just built over an old graveyard. It was built to seal something underneath. The dreams, they won't stop. I hear them calling to me every night. But tonight, I will open the basement door. I have to know the truth. Holloway swallowed hard. A former headmaster had come down here too. But why had he never returned? His grip tightened on the journal as he turned the next page. And then, footsteps. Holloway went rigid. They weren't his. They came from the darkness ahead. And then, a whisper. Not from the front, but right next to his ear. You won't leave either. Holloway spun around and bolted. He raced up the stone steps. Desperate to escape. The exit was just ahead. Slam. The door shut tight in his face. He crashed into it, pounding his fists against the wood. Someone opened the door. Silence. No one could hear him. Behind him, the footsteps grew closer. Holloway turned, cold sweat dripping down his back. In the darkness, a pair of glowing red eyes stared back at him. Then, it started crawling toward him, grinning. The next morning, when the sun rose, the teachers found the basement door locked. No one had seen Principal Holloway since the night before. His office light was still on. His chair was still pulled out. His journal still lay open on his desk. But on the last page, a new line had been added, written in blood. I opened the door. I can't close it anymore. Part 5. The door slowly opens. That morning, Principal Holloway was nowhere to be found. The teachers assumed he had left in a hurry. But no one knew where he had gone. His office light was still on. His chair still warm. And his journal still open on the desk. But the strangest part, no one could remember what had happened the night before. Knocking at midnight. That night, Caleb Miller lay awake in bed, restless. The boys' dormitory at St. Augustine was freezing. Even though the windows were shut tight, the wind howled outside, but it wasn't nearly as unsettling as the knocking in the hallway. Caleb jolted upright. Who the hell was knocking at 2 a.m.? He heard the door to the next room creak open. Hello? Who's there? Ethan Carter's groggy voice mumbled. No answer. Only the sound of faint breathing, right outside Ethan's door. Then, the knocking continued, moving from door to door, until it reached Caleb's room. He held his breath. The knocking stopped. Seconds dragged on, thick with silence. Then, his door creaked open. Just a crack, even though he was sure he had locked it. A breath, cold as death, brushed against the back of his neck. Something had entered the room. It wasn't just Caleb. Every student in the dorm had the same nightmare that night. Ethan dreamed of walking down a dark hallway, where the walls melted like candle wax. From the corner of the corridor, he heard soft, pitiful sobs. He stepped closer. A little girl sat curled up, her long hair covering her face. Ethan. She whispered his name. He froze. How did she know his name? Then, she lifted her head. She had no eyes. Just empty, black sockets that bore into him as her mouth stretched into a grin far too wide for her face. Something is watching us from below. Ethan screamed. He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, but as he started to sit up, a hand shot out from under his bed, gripping his ankle. Ethan let out a blood-curdling scream. The next morning, no one spoke about what had happened, but every student in the dorm shared the same unshakable fear. They had all heard the knocking. They had all seen the nightmares. And worst of all, they all felt something watching them from beneath the floor. That night, a group of students gathered in the main hallway. Caleb, Ethan, Sophia Brooks, Madeline Carter, and a few others. All of them haunted by what had happened. We can't just sit here and do nothing, Caleb whispered, his voice unsteady. Something's wrong with this school. Ethan nodded. I asked a teacher about Principal Holloway this morning. He just said the principal had left, but the way he looked at me, like he was hiding something. Sophia hesitated before speaking. I did some research in the library. This school was built over an abandoned graveyard. But here's the weird thing. There are no records of a basement. But we all know it's there. Madeline muttered. Last night, who else heard the knocking? Silence. Then, one by one, they all nodded. A cold draft swept through the hallway. Then there's only one way to find out. Caleb swallowed hard. We have to go down there. They exchanged nervous glances, but no one backed out. Together, they walked toward the door leading to the forbidden basement. It was still locked, but the moment they reached for the handle, the door swung open. A foul stench wafted up, forcing them to cover their noses. Below them, a long, narrow staircase spiraled into the abyss. A gust of freezing air drifted up from the depths. And from the darkness below, a weak, trembling voice echoed through the silence. Help me. No one moved. Then, Ethan's voice wavered. Did you hear that? Madeline swallowed hard. Hear what? Ethan's face turned pale. Something's coming up the stairs. Part 6. The basement door opens. Caleb and his friends cautiously descended the stairs, each step echoing with an eerie resonance. No one knew where they were truly headed. No one knew if they would ever return. The air grew heavier, as if the basement itself were swallowing their very breaths. Then, suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. Madeline clamped her hand over her mouth, her face drained of color. The headmaster's voice. Ethan whispered. There was no time to hesitate. Caleb switched on his flashlight and led the group deeper into the darkness. Headmaster Holloway. At the far end of the gloomy corridor. They found him. Principal Holloway sat curled up in the corner. His clothes tattered and smeared with blood. His entire body trembled as if he had endured an endless nightmare. His eyes were sunken, the sclera unnaturally white, and his lips continuously murmured nonsensical words. "Don't open the door. Don't open the door. They'll come out. They'll devour us alive." Terrified, Madeline covered her mouth. The headmaster was speaking of them. But who were they? Caleb knelt beside him. "Principal Holloway, can you hear us?" The headmaster looked up, his ghostly white eyes suddenly fixated on Caleb. "Run! Get out before they..." Before he could finish, something dragged him violently into the darkness. "No!" Caleb cried as he lunged forward, grabbing him just before he was completely pulled away. Together, the group managed to pull Holloway free from the unseen force clutching him. As they pulled him away, the stone door behind them slammed shut, shaking the entire basement. A furious, desperate scream echoed from behind that door, as if something had been trapped inside. Once they hauled Holloway out of the basement, he began convulsing violently. His eyes went wide, and his mouth spewed strange words in a language no one could understand. Teachers later discovered that the frantic group of students had rushed Holloway to the hospital. But as soon as he was taken away, the basement door automatically locked itself. No one could open it again. The next day, the next morning, news of the incident exploded across every headline. Headmaster of St. Augustine Academy found under mysterious circumstances. Students recount horrific supernatural phenomena. The mystery of the school built on an abandoned graveyard. Reporters swarmed the school, desperate to uncover the secrets of the hidden basement. But, strangely enough, the basement door would not open. Holloway has yet to escape the darkness. Even though he had escaped, Holloway was no longer the man he once was. He could not speak normally. He had lost all memory of what happened in the basement. Yet every night, the hospital could hear him screaming in terror. Doctors witnessed him thrashing on his bed, shrieking like a wild animal, his eyes bulging, and on some nights, they saw him standing in the corner of his room, facing a wall, muttering something in a voice that wasn't his. One might have thought it was all over. But then, the students continued to hear knocking at midnight. A week later, a student vanished right on campus. The police found no trace of him, though the basement door had been locked. That night, someone saw it open once again. A cold wind blew up from below, and from the deep darkness, a single phrase was whispered. "The door has not closed yet." Part 7. The curse is lifted. The mysterious disappearance of a student on the grounds of St. Augustine drew intense scrutiny from both law enforcement and the media. In the end, local authorities made the decision to investigate the hidden basement, where Principal Holloway had once been imprisoned. And when they finally broke through the stone door, the horrifying truth was revealed. Historians were called in, and old records were unearthed. As it turned out, the land where St. Augustine stood had indeed been a cemetery in the late 19th century. When the school was constructed in the early 1900s, Only a small portion of the remains had been relocated. The rest, over 200 souls, had been left behind. Buried beneath the school, forgotten by time, centuries of unrest, anger, and despair had festered beneath the foundation, manifesting into the nightmares that plagued students and faculty alike. Authorities ordered the complete demolition of St. Augustine. Workers excavated the graves, carefully transferring every last set of remains to a proper burial ground. Yet, throughout the process, strange occurrences continued. Machinery frequently malfunctioned without explanation. Workers were shoved, despite no one being near them. Some claimed to hear whispers rising from the ground at night. But the moment the final grave was relocated, everything went still. The air grew eerily quiet, as though the land itself had exhaled a long-held breath. The spirits, at last, were at peace. Years later, a brand new school was built on the old grounds of St. Augustine. No more cold hallways, no more phantom footsteps, no more knocking in the dead of night. The new school became an ordinary place, free of the horrors that once lurked within its walls. Principal Holloway, still not free. Principal Holloway was discharged from the hospital, but he never returned to teaching. He moved to a quiet town, far from the prying eyes of reporters. Yet those who saw him claim that even after all these years, he would sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night. He no longer remembered exactly what happened in that basement. But one thing he was certain of: though the curse had been lifted, something was still watching him. If you were in St. Augustine Academy, would you dare to step into the basement? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.